Well, according to Reader's Digest, I have an amazing body. And so do you as well. Your amazing body. Now, this is good news. I don't know what you expected to hear at church today, but we all have amazing bodies, which is fantastic. The article talks up our arteries as being highways for our blood. Our immune system is like a big burly bodyguard protecting us from all sorts of rough things, which is particularly hard to hear for Kiralee and John, our lead pastor and his wife, because they have COVID. So the burly bodyguard has let them down. Our bones are described as constantly rebuilding. Well, this sounds fantastic, doesn't it? And it concludes, you won't believe how brilliantly designed you are. And we are. God has made us and our bodies, and they work pretty well. But Reader's Digest wasn't going to leave it there. A few pages later, in between articles about arthritis and some ads about hair loss, they introduced me to a news story about my body, as if I didn't get the hint already. The health advances that will keep you humming for years. Now, if you can read between the lines there, wasn't I humming anyway? Don't I have these constantly rebuilding bones? No, it turns out things are going to go a little bit wrong. Now, I shouldn't have been surprised. You see, if you look at the small print, or rather the large print on this cover, have a look at this. Oh, anyway, I've lost activation. But there you can see at the bottom of the masthead the words large print. Now, there's a clue that our bodies aren't always going to be amazing. If you want to see the Bible that I use, this is extra large print. I think the front row can read it because I've been struggling with my eyesight. And that's not the least of what I'm going to have to worry about. Apparently, as it goes on, I'm going to have to worry about blood pressure, cholesterol, and that is just the tip of the iceberg. Sure, the article had a few remedies, a few little points of hope, things, but despite all our medical breakthroughs, it became clear that they couldn't deal with our number one problem. And the number one problem is death. Death is there and it's lurking. And so we can delay it, but we can't deal with it. We can't stop it. And let's not kid ourselves, death is a major problem. Now, my first experience of death was very minor, but for kids, this is often our first experience. It's when you lose a pet. I lost my guinea pig when I was about 10, and that was my first experience of death, and I didn't like death at all. When I was a teenager, I lost my last two grandparents. The first two had died when I was very young and didn't know them. And that's when death starts to hit hard. And there's people in this room for whom death has been hitting them harder and harder. But instead of a magazine talking about our amazing bodies, imagine if the cover story was about a cure for death. Imagine if there was a cover story about that. Well, it turns out when we come to our passage today, John chapter 11, that really is the cover story about a remedy for death and the one who can speak to it. It starts in John's biography of Jesus' life in chapter 11. If you have a Bible from the seat underneath in front of you, you can pull that out. I don't have the page number in front of me. I think it's 1067 or something like that, 76. So John chapter 11. We're going to start in various places, but I want you to have verse 6 there. So you'll see John, and then you'll see a big number 11, then you'll see a tiny little number 6. Don't worry if you can't read that. It just means your amazing body is starting to falter. John chapter 11 starts with a family in crisis. And it's not just any family, it's a family that has supported Jesus in the early years of his ministry. These are Jesus' mates, his friends. Now, for kids from camp, this is like your cabin group. All right? You're meant to be tight. You've spent time together. You're meant to have each other's backs. And these are the sort of people that Jesus is connected with. Mary and Martha and Lazarus, these are people like his cabin buddies. But Lazarus is now dead in the prime of his life. And what's really shocking is that Jesus had the opportunity to act before he died. And we already know from earlier in John's biography of Jesus that Jesus has been able to act when people are sick and prevent them from getting more sick or from dying. Back in verse 6 of chapter 11, where I got you to find, we hear, when Jesus heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Jesus stays at a distance. He lingers. He's heard that his good friend is sick, one of his cabin buddies, and he stays 2 more days. Now, for Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, the number one priority for them is to restore Lazarus to health. Any delay seems unnecessary, unexpected, and distressing. Imagine if at camp, you're one of the campers and you trip over and you scrape your knee and there's blood coming out. And your camp leader is there, let me just finish this coffee. No, that delay seems unexpected and unnecessary. Forget about your coffee. There's a machine, you can just press another button, it'll give you another coffee. Come and help me. We want Jesus to act quickly in this situation, and we feel that. We feel that Jesus, like Mary and Martha, must act quickly. He must act decisively. Have you ever been in a position where you needed somebody to act quickly and decisively? I was once in such a position. I was 9 years old or thereabouts, and my parents were out, and me and my brothers and sisters were there, and we were rummaging through their stuff, and I came across one of their old suitcases. As you can see, I was a lot smaller then, and this was the suitcase that I said I could claim to fit inside of. Well, actually, it's not the actual suitcase, but it works well as a prop. I said to my brothers and sisters, I reckon I could fit inside there. My older brother said, I'd like to see that. So we opened up the suitcase, I crawled inside, had to crawl into the fetal position, scrunched up, and then they closed the lid and put the latch on. The problem was, once your body is in there and the latch is closed, there is pressure. Your body is pressing up the end, and they couldn't get the latch open. For a moment there, I was panicking for my life. Then my older brother did what only older brothers can do, and he sat on me. He sat on the lid of the suitcase, it released the pressure and popped the lid so I could safely get out of the suitcase. I needed my brother to act quickly and to act decisively. Any delay could have been fatal. There was not going to be a lot of oxygen there. My number one priority once I got into the suitcase was to get out of the suitcase. But power changes everything. Imagine if when I was inside the suitcase, I actually had power. Because inside the suitcase, I had no power. I was totally dependent on those outside of the suitcase. But if I had a latch inside the suitcase that I could have pressed at any time, that would have made all the difference to the situation. I would not have been so concerned. I wouldn't have felt as powerless. Jesus is able to reach inside death, find a latch, and click it open. And that's what's at challenge here with Lazarus, as he has died and been dead now for 4 days. And strangely, it turns out that a temporarily dead Lazarus is, in the hands of Jesus, more useful than a living Lazarus, which sounds a little bit startling. Earlier, Jesus said to his disciples in verse 15, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake, I'm glad I was not there. Why is he glad that he's not there? Well, it says in verse 15, so that you may believe. They had various categories for Jesus. Jesus the healer, Jesus the teacher, but Jesus in the face of death. The delay was intentional to demonstrate Jesus' authority over death. And if you think that it's a little bit cruel that he's delayed and let Lazarus go through this experience, remember that Jesus himself would later submit to the idea that a dead Jesus would be of more use to his Father God than a living one, at least temporarily. So that Jesus himself would be willing to climb inside of death and experience death and all its weight for God's purposes and plans. And Jesus knew that. He knew that there was power over death. And he trusted his Father completely. If you turn over a few pages in your Bible to John chapter 12, so you see a big number 12 for the chapter, and then you go to the little number 24. So John chapter 12, verse 24, it says this, Jesus says, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. What's he talking about? He's talking about his own death and how his death will be purposeful. That if he dies, good is going to come out of it. That there's a hint that he's not even going to stay dead. Mary and Martha only know about death as a roadblock, as something that is not a pathway to anywhere else. Both say to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. There's sadness in that, maybe a little bit of accusation. They knew that Jesus had power when somebody was sick. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. Mary and Martha, they have a trust in Jesus. And maybe at camp, maybe in your life, you've got a category for Jesus and some trust. Jesus can do certain things. Jesus the teacher. Later on in this passage, when Martha calls her sister Mary, she says, the teacher is here. Jesus the feeder of thousands. And some of you would have heard about that at scripture classes. Even Jesus the healer of the blind and sick. If you go back a few chapters, you'll hear about Jesus doing such things. But like all of us, Mary and Martha had put Jesus into a box. Jesus the teacher, Jesus the healer. Jesus, but could he deal with death? It was a big box that they had for Jesus, but the box was still too small. Jesus was much bigger than the categories they had. We're all used to meeting people in our lives and we think, okay, this person's impressive. Oh no, this person's impressive. But Jesus just blows them all out of the water. For Mary and Martha, Jesus can heal, but death is death. And they live in a world in which they face death with their animals, with their loved ones. Where there isn't as good medicine and hospital system, death comes more quickly. Surely Jesus couldn't reach into that realm. Surely he needed to be here earlier. Surely Jesus is running late. Or perhaps he could reach into that realm. Martha is clearly not sure. If you go back to John chapter 11, so John chapter 11, the big 11, and then verse 22, this is what Martha says. So one of the sisters of Lazarus, I know that God will give you whatever you ask. So here in the face of death, Martha says to Jesus, I know that God will give you whatever you ask. So she seems to show some trust. She's looking to Jesus. But then later, as the dialogue goes on, Jesus says, I'm the resurrection. And she says, yes, I know that my brother will rise again ultimately in the future in heaven, but not here on this earth. But Jesus is taking Mary and Martha and the disciples and the other grieving people around them on a journey as to who he really is. He destroys all small categories, all the boxes that we might put him in. He's not primarily trying to bring a new strategy for life, a new sort of way. He doesn't there line up on the self-help books of how to do things or clues to getting your homework done faster. He's not a medicine man, just merely medicine man who deals with a few ailments or illnesses. He's claiming that he can disarm death. And with it, its root cause, which is sin. Sin is being hostile and opposed to God, turning your back on God, which is why we have this after-school kids club called 180. 180 speaks about how we're facing this way, and with God's help, he brings us back into relationship with him. We've turned our back on God. Sin is not a small problem, it's a big problem. It's a bit like the suitcase that I showed you earlier. Sin is living our way, doing what we want, when we want. So we can say, I'm going to go on an adventure. I'm going to do what I want. My adventure is I'm going to go inside this suitcase. That sounds exciting. That sounds interesting. But our own adventures and living our own way leads to tragedy. Now, that's really easy to see with the suitcase. But what about the other things in our life? When we do things our own way, when we say everyone's going to have to go and do it my way. That's the only way this is going to happen. It's my way. Things don't work. When we say it's my money and my time and I'll do what I want, does it always work out that well when we live our way? But what if God has made us and he's made us for a relationship with him and he's made us to live for his honour and for the service of others? Then perhaps we'll find ourselves on a different adventure going God's way and not our own way. Well, I could have died in that suitcase when I was 9 years old. Thankfully, I didn't. And sin is deadly like that suitcase. But if there is one who could deal with death, even its root cause, sin, well, that's the one that Mary and Martha need to know about. They're there waiting at the tomb. They're watching Jesus. They're grieving. They don't have a category yet for Jesus to deal with this. They need to know who Jesus is in the face of death. And anyone who's been to a funeral wants to know as well. They want to know who Jesus is in the face of death. Look with me at verse 25 of chapter 11. What Jesus says with these words, I am the resurrection and the life. Now, in John's biography of Jesus, when he says I am, he uses this phrase a number of times, and it talks about his character and his identity. And here he's saying, I am the resurrection and the life. In the face of death, I am the resurrection and the life. And then in verse 43, so he says the words, but then he backs it up with his action. Verse 43, Lazarus, come out. Now, to stand in the face of a tomb of a person who's been dead for 4 days and to say, Lazarus, come out, you've got to really back yourself. Nobody would really try that unless they are actually God's son, as Martha acknowledges him earlier on, acting with God's authority, and that he can speak to death. He can speak to that number one problem of sin and death. Lazarus, come out. And what does Lazarus do? Well, if he does come out, if I said, Lazarus, come out, who are you? I don't respond to you. Death laughs at me. But when Jesus, the author of life, the co-creator there with his Father, says, Lazarus, come out, death falls away and Lazarus hears and comes out. You know, in the past when people were buried, they used to pay sometimes a little bit extra. When their coffin was laid, they would have a little string that would go all the way up to the gravestone with a bell attached to it, just in case, on the odd chance, and kids, trust me, this doesn't happen, somebody is buried alive so they can ring the bell. Say, I'm here. Now, that's a little bit like the latch inside to give you a clue to say, hey, I'm here, I'm alive. There's a way out. Jesus is the only way out. He is the resurrection and the life. He's the only one who speaks definitively to death. Death won't stop him in his tracks. Remember what he said? I am the resurrection and the life. Words that he backed up by raising Lazarus from the dead. And so when Jesus delayed those 2 more days, he delayed for a reason. Because Jesus delayed, he had the opportunity to show that he was more than a healer, that he was the author of the life. And they needed to know that. They needed to know it that day, and they'd need to know it in a few weeks' time. Because Jesus delayed, news of Lazarus' resurrection would sweep the surrounding villages, and many would put their trust in Jesus, which we saw right at the end of our passage in verse 45. Because of Lazarus' resurrection, many put their trust in Jesus. And because Jesus delayed, opposition to him would rise up. In verse 46, we saw a hint that some doubted, and they went to the Pharisees, the Jewish rulers, and they said, Jesus is doing some strange stuff. And what did these Jewish rulers decide? Jesus is too much of a problem. We need to arrest him. It's better that one person dies than the whole nation crumbles. And later on, they would decide that it was even good to kill Lazarus again because he was causing too much of a problem. So because Jesus delayed, that opposition grew to fever pitch. They would arrest Jesus and they would see to his crucifixion that they would kill Jesus. And because Jesus delayed, his actions that day gave us a sign that even death itself would not stop Jesus in his tracks. Perhaps in your life it feels like Jesus has delayed in acting on some things. There's been some times where you wanted Jesus to sweep in and stop something or change something. The last time I spoke about this passage was at my brother-in-law's funeral. I wanted him to come in and stop that. Thankfully, he understood that Jesus was the resurrection and the life. Mary and Martha had their doubts, but they kept looking to Jesus. They kept looking to the one who could help them, who could ultimately save them, and so must we. Which brings us to what happened a few weeks later, after Jesus was arrested and crucified and died. Normally that's where the story ends for people's biography, but that's not where Jesus' story ends. A guy's walking along and he falls into a hole. And he's stuck in there and he hears some footsteps a little while later walking past, and he says, "Hey, you up there, can you help me?" And it turns out it's a priest. And the priest looks down. He says, "That's quite a predicament. Let me write out a prayer for you." He writes it out and drops it down in the hole and walks on. The guy's a little bit exasperated by that. And he waits and he waits. Then he hears some more footsteps. And he says, "Hey, you up there, can you help me?" The guy looks down. He says, "Look, I'm a doctor. I'll see what I can do." So he gets out his prescription pad, writes out a prescription, tears it off and puts it down the hole and walks on. That's not much use. He lasts in the hole a little bit longer. Finally, he hears some more footsteps. "Hey, you up there, can you help me? I'm stuck down here." This time it's Jesus. Jesus looks down the hole and sees him and jumps in the hole. And the guy says to him, "What are you doing? Now we're both stuck." And Jesus says, "Don't worry, I've been down here before and I know the way out." Jesus knows the way out of death, of the biggest hole that we can find ourselves stuck in. And as amazing as the resurrection of Lazarus was, it's a preview of better things, which we've just heard. For Lazarus, death was interrupted, but eventually Lazarus would grow old again. So he comes back to life, true. He lives for maybe decades longer, but eventually he will die, and his family will grieve, and death will have revisited them. But Jesus has his eyes fixed not on extending our physical lives, which are amazing bodies, but as we know, not so amazing bodies. But Jesus has his eyes not fixed on securing that extension, but rather his mission is to secure an eternal relationship and spiritual life between us and God. So he's not looking just to give an extension in this physical life, but he's looking to deal with something more profound and bridge the gap between us and God. And he's going to do that ultimately through a bodily resurrection in all eternity. A new body and a different body, a truly capital A, amazing body. Fast forward to John chapter 20, which we just heard read, and Jesus has died on the cross and his dead body is placed in a tomb. Does that sound familiar? The last time we heard about a tomb in John's biography was in chapter 11, the tomb that Jesus found himself at with Lazarus. And like that day at the tomb with Lazarus, everyone on that first Easter was at the limits of their faith. Sickness, disease, blindness, sure, Jesus could heal that. But death? Surely death was beyond Jesus, even out of his league, when he himself was in it. It's one thing to raise Lazarus from the dead, but yourself? Surely not. In John chapter 11, everyone signed off on Lazarus' death certificate. His sisters, Mary and Martha, his friends, the entire village. He was dead, 4 days dead. Everybody signed off on his death certificate except for Jesus. And on that first Easter day, John chapter 19 tells us that the Romans and Jewish leaders had also signed off on Jesus' death. One thing they were good at doing was if somebody needed to be executed, they could deal with it. They could be sure. He was dead and buried and behind them. No more Jesus to worry about. And even the disciples had given up on Jesus. They were only there at the tomb that day because one of the women had come back and reported that the tomb was empty. It seemed that everyone had signed off on his death except the one who mattered most, Jesus himself. Jesus is there and he's alive. And notice he's not inside the tomb, he's there outside of the tomb. Jesus has access to the latch inside of death to release himself from it. Jesus is God's son. He's acting with God's authority and he's able to speak to death. And whilst death will strike all of us, Jesus has the authority to forgive sins and to raise us to life with him in heaven. It's like my suitcase illustration. There is a latch inside of death, but you can't wait until you die to access it. You have to locate it and take hold of it now in this life. And that's what we're hearing about today. And it's something of what we've been hearing about at camp the other week. Jesus says clearly in John 11:25, I am the resurrection and the life. It's little wonder that after those words, we could hear the risen Jesus say to the stunned Mary in chapter 20, verse 17, go to my brothers and sisters and tell them, I am ascending to the Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Something profound has changed about Jesus. He has risen, but he's in a resurrection body. And something profound has changed in God's orientation to humanity. Jesus, in human flesh, has come, and he's died a death on a cross, not for his sin, but for our sin, to deal with the punishment for sin. And yet he's come through the other side and he has a resurrection body. And so humanity and God can be in relationship through the one who has the power over sin and death. And for all those who avail themselves of Jesus' death for the sin, they are today and forever in God's family. They can be called brothers and sisters of Christ. They can be called sons and daughters of God. To both Lazarus' death and to his own death, Jesus says, as well as to our death, I am the resurrection and the life. He said it in Lazarus' funeral. He speaks it through his actions in his own resurrection from the dead, and he offers it to us now. He's saying that life is contained within him. It's sustained within him. And for those who are on junior camp, we heard a bit about that in the first talk that Jono gave when he talked about there, right at creation, God spoke creation into being. And how Jesus was there at creation, speaking words of life. To those who want to live fully now and also be victorious over death, he says what he said to Martha. Back in verse 25, he who believes in me will live even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. And then he turns to Martha and in turn to us and asks an important question. Do you believe this? Do you believe this? Martha's response to the one who believes and who will never die, to Jesus, is, yes, Lord, I believe you are the Christ, the Son of God. I believe you're the King. I believe you're God's Son, the one who has come into the world. What is your response to the question? The question from this passage, the question from Jesus' lips, do you believe this? Do you believe that sin is a big problem, living our own way? Do you believe that Jesus died for a purpose, to deal with our sin? Do you believe that he speaks to death? Now, if you have more questions for the kids, I want you to come and join us at 180 After School Kids Club. It's starting back at the start of February, Friday afternoons, 4 p.m. We continue to explore these things. If you're adults, I want you to come and join us for Christianity Explored. We're going to hear a little bit more about it later on, but it's a great course that allows you to investigate a biography of Jesus' life and ask any questions that you have. But if perhaps today is the day where the penny has dropped and you've realised, no, Jesus isn't just a teacher, he isn't just a healer. He's the one who speaks to sin and death. He is the author of life. And you want to put your trust in him. I've written out a simple prayer. It's there on your outline, and I'll put it on the screen as well. The prayer goes like this, so let me read it to start with. Loving God, you made me and you give me life. Forgive me for living my own way and not following your way. I choose to follow Jesus. Thank you for his death and life that washes my sin away and enables me to live in relationship with you now and forever. It's a very simple prayer, but it's saying, I acknowledge Jesus as my King. I want him as the author of my life and the one who has and is able to defeat death and sin. So if this is your prayer, there's an opportunity now to pray it. So I'm going to pray out loud. You can pray quietly in your own heart. So let's talk to God. Loving God, you made me and you give me life. Forgive me for living my own way and not following your way. I choose to follow Jesus. Thank you for his death and life that washes my sin away and enables me to live in relationship with you now and forever. Amen. Amen.